Good morning. Thank you so much to Nth Generation for the invitation. This is a very exciting event for us at Homeland Security Investigations. Whenever we get the opportunity to reach out to the private sector, to introduce ourselves, the scope of our work, and the interface that we seek to have, and relay the importance of traversing from the public sector to the private sector, we always jump at that opportunity. So myself, I am a supervisory special agent with Homeland Security Investigations. I oversee an anti-money laundering group for the special agent in charge office in Los Angeles. I have a colleague with me who will be sitting on a panel later today, Special Agent Christopher Hicks, who's more of our subject matter expert in this area. For me, my purpose today is to try and give you an overview of what my agency is about, how it fits into the larger federal law enforcement construct, how it fits into the overall governmental infrastructure, how those capabilities of these various departments and agencies come together and come apart with different mission sets, how that then impacts you and fulfills or at least illuminates some of your expectation, and with an eye towards how we can interact, because there is a diversity of experience and missions amongst yourselves. So let me just start at kind of the beginning. So Homeland Security Investigations is the most unique law enforcement agency in the world. The reason for that is because of the depth and breadth of the mission. We're not solely a criminal enforcement agency. We also have administrative authority. We essentially can look at any person or thing that crosses an international border. We're present in the United States and abroad. And we work with, obviously, a lot of different agencies within the intelligence and investigative aspects of the U.S. government and our allied governments primarily. But again, I'll go through some of our offices and where we're located and things like that, go through some of the programs that we're involved in, and then what we've been trying to do, how we've been trying to evolve around facing this, fifth dimension of conflict in the cyber world. We formed out of the ashes of 9/11 when the Department of Homeland Security was created. It was a new concept, and it needed to be defined. Largely, it was defined. We built that bridge as we were on it. From a branding standpoint, we in the investigative side, call ourselves Homeland Security Investigations. We are a subset of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which was the original agency created within the department back in 2003. Kind of started getting its momentum around 2004. I myself came from the legacy Department of Treasury agency, Department of Customs. We were merged with the Immigration and Naturalization Services investigative branch to be the largest investigative component within the new department. Mission statement, the initial focus in the beginning of the agency was really on counterterrorism. I spent the early part of my career conducting counterterrorist financial investigations. I was seconded to the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force for a number of years. But then we realized that terrorism is really a subset of transnational organized crime, and that's really more parallel with our capability and the various aspects of what we do. We are a law enforcement agency. We investigate people that are committing federal crimes. This is members of our special response teams that go out and do a lot of the hard work for us. Now, our investigative methodology. The way I kind of like to describe it quickly for folks to try and understand where we fit in the larger architecture of the U.S. government is we're kind of the outside-inside investigative agency, and I'd compare us to the FBI is they're kind of the inside-outside. We complement each other in many ways. They are the largest investigative agency in the United States government. We're the second largest. We're the largest within the Department of Homeland Security. Now, what we seek to do is attack threats at the point of genesis, where they're most vulnerable. I myself was stationed at our London office at the embassy in Grosvenor Square for approximately 5 years. I, with a lot of my colleagues that are sprinkled around the world, are looking to foster engagement. So much of the ethos of the Department of Homeland Security, but Homeland Security investigations, is about sharing, information sharing. That's why we were created. Right? The post 9/11 paradigm is about breaking down these silos and looking to share information. So my job when I'm overseas is to find who are the capable partners. How do I form these bonds? How do I leverage their skills? How do I leverage your skills? Right? This becomes a seminal issue for us in the job that we're trying to do. We recognize that we don't hold all of the skill set, but that people who are like-minded with us can join with us to do things better. Now you can see we're sprinkled throughout the interior of the United States. Oftentimes that surprises people, but there is, as I mentioned, the jurisdiction begins and ends somewhat at the international borders. Those are not solely contiguous borders. They're functional equivalents of the border. So any international airport is essentially the first port of entry. So we have jurisdiction. We work very closely with our sister agency, Customs and Border Protection, who you would probably recognize at the airports in the blue uniforms and the one that are processing your documents for entry into the U.S. They're more of an interdiction-based agency. Border Patrol, who I'm sure you hear a lot about in the press, is a component of Customs and Border Protection. Again, as I mentioned, we are overseas. This number changes, and these locations change periodically. It's changed significantly since I was in our International Affairs Division at headquarters some 10 years ago, and it's been nothing but growth. Premised mostly on one of our programs, which I'll get into and introduce you to the scope of our work in 1 second. But this, along with all of those offices and personnel that you've seen on these slides, are different components, other offices that foster our mission and support us that we can rely upon. Of particular note in this context is the Cyber Crime Center, which is our agency hub for the growth of our skill in the IT realm, and I'll focus a little bit more on that as I move through my presentation. So our different investigative priorities. I put this slide up first because this has been the biggest growth area for us internationally. So within the U.S. government, it's the State Department that is our real primary interface. So when I was over in London, I was part of the mission there. I was essentially folded into the Department of State. They're the ones that let people in. They're the friendly face of the United States. Well, we're the people that kick folks out. So in this sort of point of genesis methodology, we decided, you know what, it'd probably make our job a little bit easier if we work with the State Department to determine who should or should not be given a visa or entry into the United States. So we propped up these visa security units, mostly to focus on, as a counterterrorism measure, obviously with all the refugees that have moved towards the Middle East and North Africa from various points in Europe and Asia. This becomes very, very critical because you have citizens, say, of the UK that also may be dual nationals of country in the Middle East, and they can go there and they can travel to Syria and fight for ISIS, and then they look to go back to the UK, and then they can come over on visa waiver to the US. That's a gap that we have worked with the Brits very closely and our other allies to close. Counterproliferation, this is one of our, what I say, high side programmatic areas. We interface a lot with the intelligence community here, and this focuses on commodities that are what we call dual use or single use. A grenade is a single use item. Night vision goggles are a dual use item. There is a civilian purpose for night vision goggles, however, it mostly has a military capability or application. So those items are controlled because they cross borders. We have jurisdiction. We work very closely with the intelligence community. When I was in London, one of the biggest things that we had in the counterproliferation realm was merely handguns, which seemed so benign to us as Americans, but in that country, they're illegal, and they treat them very, very strictly. And so we interfaced with them on those joint investigations quite often. But when it comes to Iran, other nations that might be seeking to tap into the technology, not only that you develop, but that are also developed for war fighting, they become a little more serious. Airplane replacement parts, for example, things of that nature. Transnational gangs, essentially the basis from which we spring focuses on networks. So juxtapose that to maybe a local police department that really is focusing more on quality of life crimes. I live in this neighborhood, there's a street gang, they harass people, they sell drugs, and commit other crimes. That primarily will fall to a local police department. It becomes a homeland security issue based on scale and network. So we look for those networks because we have that domestic and international scope. We're able to then take these jurisdictions cross state lines to other major metropolitan areas to look at federal charges under RICO, or in my context, money laundering crimes. They get the illicit proceeds that they might get from prostitution. What do they do with that? Does it go through a banking system? So we look to tackle it and complement the jurisdiction of our local officers. That's more of the federal scope. That's why when you see a lot of these federally based investigations, they can take so long. So many people are curious and they ask me, what do you think about the Mueller investigation with the special prosecutor? What's happening? We don't hear anything. Our investigations can take years. For somebody to be involved in a case for 3 years, if they say that in a conversation or they're seeking support, it'd be like, okay, where are we at? We understand it's gonna take that long. So, in contrast to what happens on a local level, the police departments can't rely on taking people off a street corner for more than a month. Corrupt government officials, human rights crimes, that feeds into our human trafficking and child sex tourism programs as well. Intellectual property rights. So when I was in London, I managed a couple different programs. Intellectual property rights was one. And I'll talk a little bit more on that just to highlight a difference in methodology within the IT realm of how we as Americans focus on something and how the Brits might in terms of enforcement activities. But these are very serious crimes. A lot of times they're overlooked. People think, well, what's the big deal about a copied DVD for a movie or Nike trainers? For us, those are important, but we prioritize these things around health and safety. And when you have counterfeit cancer drugs, which, as invidious as that scheme is, people do it. I investigated or participated in an investigation while I was in the UK that involved that very thing, airbags in cars. So that it becomes a very high priority for us. And we have investigative groups in our larger offices focus solely on these subject matter areas. For me, because I work in financial crime, and that is for the most part, aside from sociopaths and psychopaths, the motive behind criminal activity, I'm able to traverse all these programmatic areas and investigate cases, or the agents in my group are investigating cases across the entire spectrum, which makes this particular area a very rich one to work in. Again, human smuggling, trafficking, and child exploitation, child sex tourism. And I bring that up because that brings me to a point in evolution within HSI related to this context where we really kind of sprang from. We focus mostly on cyber-enabled crime. And the first area of focus was around child exploitation or child pornography. And that goes all the way back to the legacy customs days where child pornography was still peddled in hard copy. And so you would see magazines or movie reels coming in from overseas. When the world evolved and technology took hold and became ubiquitous, it enabled perpetrators of these crimes to scale their operations exponentially. I mean, it's disheartening. For our teams that work in this area, we have counselors available to them for PTSD. It's a very, very difficult area to work in. It's a very tangible, visceral area. But that's where we started and built our cybercrime center to try and give some congruity and capability to what is essentially a field-driven culture that we have in our agency. You might contrast that with the FBI. And like I said, I had been seconded to the FBI for some 3 years, and they are a fantastic agency. They have such highly trained people and scope in what they do, but culturally they're very different from Homeland Security. Again, I think it's because of what caused our, us to come into being, which is namely breaking down barriers, looking to leverage relationships, share information, instead of being more traditional and close hold with information and just joint work. So with that, they started to think about how do we really enable our field divisions? Do we just give them personnel? Well, we need equipment, right? Seems like every month there's some new capability application coming out that you need to stay on top of. As it goes forward, and I have a slide on the dark net, and we'll get into the deep web and virtual currencies and cryptocurrencies and blockchains, things become even harder. This is just some of the capability, again, thematically tying it into this conference of how we've tried to use technology to support our mission. Staying on the cutting edge, being able to physically seize images and then deconstruct the images to search for commonality so we can identify victims or locations to aid us in identifying perpetrators and arresting people. And it's not just what we do, our intent is not solely linear in that traditional law enforcement model, which is investigate, arrest, prosecute. We are, like I said, looking at networks, so we focus on dismantlement, disruption as possible, positive outcomes as well. This was just a program that we stood up, one of our very first programs when I talked about building that capability. But then it adapted, and we got behind technology. How can we make this work better? Some 7-8 years later, we figure, hey, let's get online. Let's get the smartphone application. Let's have people be able to report crimes to us. We want to be able to post information on fugitives, people that have been arrested, that might have absconded, that are sex offenders. To that same end, we have what's called Angel Watch. When I was at headquarters, I actually participated in this program where we were at that time talking about an angel watch list. So being able to collect data, and I know big data is one of the topics that will be discussed, and that's obviously a subject that we speak about frequently because we are sitting on and capture major data sets, and how do we use them to fulfill our mission. At this time, what we were talking around with Angel Watch was coming up with the parallel to terrorist watch lists. Well, if we know that we have 50 different states with 50 different reporting requirements or predicate acts that could compose violations for sexual offender registration, we would need to come up with some kind of objective standard as to what crimes we would want to apply to a watch list. We have to balance civil rights as well. But how, if we get a baseline of predicate offenses, sexual offenses, and we could create a list. We could compile all that data and pull it in from all the states and create a list. So we know when somebody who is arrested in Illinois, for example, is going to travel to Thailand. That's relevant information for us. And we can try and use that. And so this is a derivative of that initial intent. And I apologize for this not being totally linear, but I wanted to throw in just topically different things that we're doing in areas where IT is really impacting what we do. Obviously, this is the brave new world, right? Blockchain technology is still being developed and applied in different ways and not fully understood. We understand that criminals like to use it. One of our largest investigations locally related to virtual currencies. We actually just did a few seizures over the last one, I think late last week, and one about 3 weeks before that, seizing Bitcoin from persons operating unlawful money exchanges to the tune of about $600,000 and $400,000 respectively. But that's something we're coming to understand, where technology and where what's happening in the private sector and the development there, we need your help with. We need to understand more of the capability. How do we apply what you're doing to keep bad actors? Operation in our sites, I mentioned with intellectual property rights and what I did, the work I was doing in London with the City of London Police, who have the national jurisdiction over intellectual property rights crimes in the UK. And this was an initiative that we had to target online perpetrators selling counterfeit goods. And our methodology was different from the City of London Police's, and then various European countries, because we would also work through Europol and try to teach best practices or derive best practices from all the different people in the space. At the time, and this is some 4 years ago, the City of London Police was the leader in Europe in IPR enforcement. Globally, we were. And our focus was a little different. So we don't work as closely with the private sector as the Brits do. And those were valuable lessons that I learned while I was over there, to see how they really enable the resources from the private sector. And there is things for us to learn from them for sure. But we took a very traditional approach to IPR enforcement. We find a site that is selling counterfeit goods. We do a test purchase. We confirm the illegality. We get the IP address. We find the actor, and we arrest the actor, and then we post this banner on the site. And we do that for messaging, right? This is about crime management. We want to deter people from committing illegal acts. So we'll put this banner on and get a million views, for example. And so we make our arrest, maybe we seize some property, that's a good outcome, a very easily measured outcome. But this is really the pretext behind and the goal of our enforcement strategy. What the Brits would do is they would work through more of a coding strategy, what they described to me as the HTML tagging. So they would go to the payment page of a site that was selling counterfeit goods, and what they noticed was that same code used on the payment page was replicated by the criminal organization on all kinds of different sites. And so all they would do is they would follow that tag to 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 different sites. And then they would turn to the private sector and say, look, I can't enforce the takedown the way the Americans do. I can't do that on 15,000 sites across the globe. So what I want you to do is not be an accomplice. I want you to review your terms of service. And I know that you don't condone illegal activity through your service. So therefore, these sites are in violation of the law, and I want you to act and shut them down. And so they would go in and just take down, unplug effectively 15,000 sites. Problem is the bad actors already had 2, 3, 4 derivative sites ready to go, and it was just this whack-a-mole. And so that's where we differed. But again, I just highlight that as to how law enforcement is coming into this space and trying to wrestle with different ways, methodologies to be effective and counter the threats that exist. I spoke some on the dark net, what's going on there. This is cutting edge. When I was in London, I participated in the European aspects of Silk Road, which was a tour-based online bazaar that was basically engaged in drug trafficking primarily. And that case at the time, for folks in the community would be aware of Silk Road, the fact that we were able to identify the operator and put him in jail for now, so I think he got a 93-year sentence, was a big outcome for us. So thematically, I talked about our cybercrime center. These are the issues that C3 is the pillars of C3, so to speak. What they're pushing out to our field offices, how we're looking to become better in this area. I put this slide up just to talk about big data quickly. TTUs are trade transparency units. So when you talk about our jurisdiction, and I talked about commodities, anything coming or going out of the US we have jurisdiction over, well, hard goods is a very big thing in Los Angeles because we have the Port of Long Beach and the Port of Los Angeles, which combined are double what any other port in the US sees. So we have all kinds of trade happening and all kinds of paperwork that is affiliated with that trade. But it's not just that. So we've joined in with all these other countries and basically said, look, we want to take these huge data sets of trade to look for anomalies. But to do that in an effective way, we need to see your data, Colombia. But we don't just need to see your data as it relates to us. We need to see all of your data. So the trade you do with Argentina, with France, we want all of that. And you can have all of ours. And so these are the partners we have in this area where we're taking these huge, huge data sets, dumping them in just to crunch, to look for those anomalous trade. Do we have beef going from Brazil to Venezuela or Venezuela to Brazil? Which way should that go? What's the commodity flow? What makes sense? Does this trading scheme make sense? Because What I focus on is trade-based money laundering, where people are taking illicit proceeds and changing the value from fiat currency into a commodity, right? So if I can take that $1 million in cocaine revenue that's located in Chicago, and I can go and buy Levi jeans and export the jeans, I don't have to worry about getting that $1 million into the banking system and owe back to Colombia. I just send the jeans and then I sell them. And now I make my money. So it's those schemes, and we're trying to penetrate and pierce the veil of those schemes. Now, this program is where we move into big department. So I mentioned the construct. So we have big Department of Homeland Security created, 22 agencies, of which we are in the investigative or law enforcement tranche. But there's all kinds of other agencies and capabilities that happen at the department level. So the department is part of the intelligence community. HSI, my department, is not, for example. So there is a trickle-down effect of information sharing, at least among the intelligence agencies, that has to happen. And there's obviously, a big divide between law enforcement and intelligence in terms of just schema. We are transparent; they are non-transparent by nature. So how do we share information across that divide? But we have relationships with the bigger department. The bigger department has massive capability. It doesn't all apply to what we're trying to do, but we try and leverage it. And they try and leverage it not only with us, but with you. And so this literally was posted last week. These are the areas that the department wants to grow through relationships like this. Looking to the private sector to say, we need to get better through these analytic exchanges. And this, that sort of mentality trickles all the way down. One of the main projects from what I'm doing is looking for ways to engage within the jurisdiction that I have with the private sector, which is mostly the financial institutions. Those are my main private sector partner. How do I engage better with an information intelligence loop to take information that they have that can help me, but how can I help them and give them direction? So these are ongoing things, and we're using the technology to help us do that, to scale the outreach and mission. I just throw this into then just a step aside. So not only do we move from agency to department, but it's department to departments and then departments to allies as well. And so this is part of the project that I'm working on, which is an online portal that we want to use to scale our information outreach with the private sector, not only the private sector folks at financial institutions, but our public sector folks with local PDs who we might not come into contact with. So IT becomes a solution. I'm confident it is a solution for us. It poses all kinds of problems and new typologies that criminal entities can utilize. But it's collectively that we're going to come together to find the common ground and how to counter those. That's just my information if you had any questions. But thank you so much for your time. It will be around Chris Hicks and myself at different panels. If you have any questions, please let us know. But again, thanks to Nth Generation for the opportunity, and it was good to speak with you all.